I'm Mike Johnson, and I'm a direct descendant of a 1900 storm survivor. My grandmother, Helen Hanson Johnson, was a survivor of the 1900 storm. She was 2 years old at the time, and she had an older brother, Harry Jr., and her parents, which were my great-grandparents, were Harry Hansen Sr., who was from Roskilde, Denmark, and my grandmother, Nellie Hansen, was from Carnoustie, Scotland, and they migrated to Texas in the late 1800s, where they met, were married, and moved to Galveston in around 1897, and that's when they moved to Bolivar Peninsula. They had a boat repair and boat building business there, and they were doing fairly well. When the 1900 storm came, they were ill prepared like everybody else, and my great-grandfather, Harry Sr., noticed that the water was starting to get high. It was very, the storm was coming, and he knew something was wrong. So he took my great-grandmother, Nellie, and my grandmother, who was 2 years old at the time, and he took them to the Bolivar Lighthouse. They were fairly good friends with the assistant lighthouse keepers at that time. The name was Edgecombe, and I think Mr. Edgecombe later became the lighthouse keeper in the 20s or 30s. I'm not quite sure about the year for that, but they were very good friends. And a lot of other people had gathered who lived in Bolivar at the time, and water was getting pretty high by then, so the women put bread in cans, and the men tied a rope from the lighthouse keeper's house to the lighthouse doors, and the people were to use this rope to hold on to while they made it from the house to the lighthouse. And they took the tins that had the bread in it, and they tied ropes onto that so they could use their hands to hold onto the ropes and then tow the bread behind them. And once they made it to the lighthouse, then they worked their way up the winding steps and were prepared to ride out the storm. My great-grandfather, Harry Sr., and his son, Harry Jr., who was 6 years old at the time, they went back to their house to try to gather things up, save what they could, tie things down, and then once they got that done, that they would make it back to the lighthouse. Well, when they made it back to their house, of course the water started getting real high, the wind was coming up, and they could not make it back to the lighthouse in time. So what they did at that point was they tied themselves into an oak tree as high up as they could get into where the branches were strong. They lashed themselves down, and this is where they rode out the storm. The house was completely demolished, and during the storm, and not much was left when they came back to it. My grandmother and great-grandmother stayed in the lighthouse with quite a few other people who had lived in the area, and also there was a train, I think, that had tried to leave Bolivar Peninsula at the time, and they couldn't make it because the tracks were washed out. So there were a lot of people in the lighthouse at the time. My grandmother, being 2 years old, she doesn't remember a whole lot, but my great-grandmother remembered quite a bit, and would tell stories of the iron doors blowing open because of the water, and sometimes some of the men who were going down to try to close the doors, they were washed away, and the storm surge would push the water higher and higher in the tube. And my grandmother said that my great-grandmother reminded her of water coming up and down in a straw, the way the storm surge would push the water in and out. And as the water rose, the people would climb higher, and it was, but they were safe from the wind and a lot of the storm surge that was going around them. After the storm, my grandfather, or great-grandfather, and great uncle, they got down out of the oak trees, and where their house was, there was nothing left except my great-grandfather's sea trunk. And he gathered my great-grandmother Nellie and my grandmother Helen, and they went back, and the only thing that they had left was the clothes that they were wearing at the time, and in a trunk that contained the family Bible and a crystal rose vase that came through the storm unbroken. So they were pretty much destitute after this, as everybody else was during the storm. My great-grandfather, and this was probably a day or so after the storm had passed, they found an old rowboat, and he had my great uncle, Harry Jr., who was 6 years old at the time. He had him row from Bolivar Peninsula Point to Galveston in a rowboat in order to find some family friends. Their name was Sanders, in hopes that they could put them up and help, give them a place to live, because they had nothing. Everything was gone. So at this time, my 6-year-old great uncle was one of the first people to go from Bolivar to Galveston after the storm. They went to Galveston after everything was said and done, and stayed with the Sanders, and they rebuilt their life. After that, they had 2 more children, Bob Hanson, and then Norman Hanson. And my great-grandfather rebuilt his boat business. They had a tugboat business, and they had their own docks, and that business lasted until the 40s, 1940, somewhere in that neighborhood. When my great-grandfather died, my great-grandmother died, and the siblings no longer could take care of it, so they had a fairly decent living after this. My grandmother, Helen Hanson, married Adolf Johnson, who was from Sweden, and she had 2 children, Adolf Robert Johnson and Norma Johnson. Had she not survived, 23 descendants would not be here today. So they were very tough people. They had no insurance, they had no FEMA, they had nothing of that nature. They started over with absolutely nothing. They continued to build and survive in Galveston. Bob Hanson was the only brother to stay in Galveston, and he died in 1975. My grandmother died in 1974. The descendants from them are spread out across the United States now, and it was an experience for them, and it's helped strengthen the family through the years.